Rain hit the streets of Seoul in sheets, hard enough to blur the neon skyline into long streaks of red and gold. Amara Bennett ran through it barefoot. Her dress was torn at the hem, soaked through, clinging to her legs with every stride. Her lungs burned. Somewhere behind her, sirens rose and fell, chasing the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She didn't know exactly when she'd started running. She only knew that 4 hours ago, her life had still made sense. Her phone kept buzzing in her clenched fist. She hadn't looked at it in over a mile. She didn't need to. She'd already seen the headline once, glowing on a stranger's phone screen as she pushed past him on the sidewalk, and that single glance had been enough to burn itself into her. Richard Bennett, prominent international businessman, found dead in his private office. Daughter Amara Bennett wanted for questioning. Such a soft, procedural word for what she'd actually seen in the detective's eyes when he found her standing over her father's body, hands shaking, blood on the hem of the same dress she was wearing now. His name was Detective O. She hadn't caught his first name, only the way he'd said hers, slow, deliberate, like he was already rehearsing it for a courtroom. "Ms. Bennett, I'm going to need you to come with us." She hadn't waited to hear the rest. Running had been instinct, not strategy. It was only somewhere around the second mile, ducking through an underpass with her heels long abandoned and her feet raw against wet concrete, that instinct started giving way to calculation. And calculation, when she let herself actually think, terrified her more than the sirens did, because someone had built this. Carefully, precisely. Her fingerprints on the letter opener buried in her father's chest. She hadn't touched it. She was almost sure she hadn't touched it, except now, running through the rain with her mind fraying at the edges, almost sure didn't feel like enough. $11 million wired into an account she barely used. The transfer dated 3 days before her father's death. And the footage. Grainy security footage from a hallway camera, time-stamped 4 minutes before his time of death, showing a woman in a dark coat who moved like her, walked like her, disappeared through a door that led straight to the room where he died. She had no memory of being there. That should have been the detail that broke her. Instead, it was the detail that kept her moving. Because if she hadn't been there, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like she had, and people who go to extraordinary lengths don't stop once. A siren screamed close enough to shake the wet air, and Amara flattened herself into a doorway, chest heaving, watching a patrol car's lights sweep across the mouth of the alley she'd just come from. She thought about her father's voice, low and urgent across the dinner table 2 nights before he died. "If anything happens to me, never trust the people closest to me." She'd asked him what he meant. He'd only shaken his head, told her it wasn't the right time, promised her they'd talk properly once a deal he was finalizing had closed. There had been no proper time. There had only been his blood on her hands and a city that had already decided her guilt before she'd had a chance to feel her own grief. The patrol car rolled past without stopping. She counted to 10 before she moved again. She ran until the buildings around her stopped looking like buildings she recognized, glass towers giving way to old brick giving way to the kind of high stone walls that didn't announce what they were protecting, only that it was worth protecting. And then she saw the gate, 20 feet of black iron, flanked by cameras that turned, almost lazily, to track her as she slowed to a stop in front of it. She knew this address, not by number, by reputation. It had been spoken in her house, the way some families spoke of illness or war. A name mentioned only in warning, never explanation. Kang Tae-hyun, her father had never told her exactly what happened between their families, only that the wound was old and that it was hers to avoid, not hers to understand. She stood there a long moment, rain running down the back of her neck, weighing the 2 futures in front of her with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. Behind her, sirens, a courtroom, a story already written about who she was. In front of her, a man who had every reason on earth to let her die exactly where she stood. She chose the man. Her fists hit the iron gate before she'd fully decided to knock. A camera above the gate blinked awake, its small red light steady, watching. Somewhere behind it, in a house she couldn't see into, someone was deciding whether she lived past the next 5 minutes. The wait felt longer than the whole 4-mile run. Then, with a low mechanical groan, the gate began to open. Kang Tae-hyun stood in the lit doorway beyond it, dressed like a man interrupted mid-evening rather than one who just watched a stranger appear, drenched and desperate, at his gate. Dark shirt, sleeves rolled. A stillness in his posture that Amara would only later learn meant he was already 3 moves ahead of whatever conversation was about to happen. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt that's finally, unexpectedly, arrived at his door. Your father is dead, he said, not a question. Why would I save his daughter? I know you hate him. Her voice cracked on the word hate, and she hated that it did. I don't even know why he never told me, but I didn't kill him. Someone set me up, and if you don't help me tonight, I'm going to prison for a murder I didn't commit. Blue and red light flickered against the wet stone wall at the end of the street, close. Closer than she'd let herself believe. Tae-hyun's eyes moved past her toward the light, then back to her face. Something shifted behind his expression, calculation, maybe, or the particular kind of curiosity a man like him reserved for problems that might be useful to him later. Behind him, a second figure appeared in the doorway, a leaner man, dark suit still perfectly pressed despite the hour, watching Amara with the sharp, unreadable attention of someone whose job was to notice everything and reveal nothing. Tae-hyun, the man said quietly, the police are 3 minutes out. I know, Hyun-woo. Tae-hyun didn't look away from Amara. Get inside, he told her. If you're already hooked, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I read everyone. He didn't offer her a towel. He didn't offer her comfort. He led her through a hallway lined with art that had probably belonged to men who no longer needed it, into a study lined with books he'd probably never read, and sat her across from him like she was a puzzle he intended to solve before deciding whether she deserved to keep breathing. Hyun-woo lingered by the door, arms crossed, saying nothing, but watching her with the particular patience of a man cataloging every twitch of her hands for later use. Tell me everything, Tae-hyun said, and if I think you're lying, I will personally walk you back out to that gate. So she told him. She told him about the calls her father had started receiving weeks earlier, calls he took in his study with the door locked, calls that left him quieter at dinner, more distracted, checking his phone in a way he never used to. She told him about the night before he died, the way he'd gripped her hand across the table with an intensity that had frightened her even then. If anything happens to me, never trust the people closest to me. He wouldn't explain what he meant, she said. I asked. He just said it wasn't the right time. There's rarely a right time, Tae-hyun said, for the truth that gets you killed. Something in the way he said it made her look at him more closely. Not sympathy exactly, recognition. You know something about that, she said. He didn't answer directly. Your father had enemies, more than you know, more I suspect than even you're prepared to understand tonight. Then help me find out who did this. Would I help the daughter of the man who destroyed my family? The words landed harder than she expected, sharper than the rain still dripping from her hair onto the floor. Destroyed how? She said. He never told me anything. I didn't even know your name until tonight, except as something my father wouldn't say in front of me. If you want me to understand what I'm apparently guilty of by association, you're going to have to actually tell me. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face. He stood instead of answering, crossing to the window, looking out at the police lights now idling at the edge of the property. His men, she realized, weren't letting them pass the gate without a fight. Neither side seemed to want tonight. I won't protect you for nothing, he said finally. I don't have money. Whatever's in that account isn't mine. I think it's part of whatever frame this is. I don't need your money. He turned back to face her. You have 2 options tonight, Ms. Bennett. You walk back out that gate and let the police take you, and you can explain to courtroom why the evidence against you is so perfectly, conveniently stacked. Or what? Or you marry me. Amara let out a short, disbelieving laugh that surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him. Behind her, she thought she heard Hyun-woo shift his weight, the closest thing to a reaction he'd offered all night. Insane, she said. Protecting an asset, Tae-hyun said, and the coldness of the word strung more than she expected it to. No one in this city touches my wife, not the police, who I own more of than you'd like to know, not whoever framed you, because attacking my wife means declaring war on me, and no one in Seoul is currently stupid enough to want that war. I'd be a wall you put your name on. Be alive, he said simply. Everything else is negotiable. She wanted to refuse on principle. Some smaller, stubborn part of her wanted to stand up, walk back through that gate, and take her chances with a system that at least pretended to care about proof. But she thought of the letter opener with her fingerprints on it, the money she'd never touched, the footage that placed her exactly where the real killer needed her to be. And she understood, with a clarity that made her slightly sick, that principle was a luxury reserved for people who still had options. Fine, she said, but I want the truth, about my father, about whatever happened between our families, all of it. In time, that's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight. He crossed the room and set a folded document on the table between them, a marriage contract already drawn up, as though he'd known exactly how this conversation would end before she'd even finished explaining herself. "One condition," he said, "never lie to me. I can forgive almost anything except that." Amara looked at the document for a long moment. Rain kept falling outside, steady, indifferent. Somewhere in this city was a killer who had taken her father's life and tried to take her freedom in the same breath, and she had no proof, no allies, nothing left in the world that would hold up against the mountain of evidence already stacked against her name. She picked up the pen. "Of course I'm using you," Tae-hyun said quietly, watching her sign. "The question is whether you want to survive long enough to use me too." She didn't answer. She just finished writing her name and became, in the space of a single signature, the wife of the one man her father had spent his entire life warning her never to trust. Behind her, she heard Hyun-woo exhale, low and almost imperceptible, the sound of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the night ahead. The wedding took place 2 days later, in a registration office with fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly ill, including the two of them. No guests. No family, no flowers. Amara had spent those 2 days inside Tae-hyun's mansion under kind of house arrest, dressed up as protection, guards outside every door, a phone taken from her for safety, and long stretches of silence broken only by Hyun-woo occasionally appearing to ask if she needed anything, then leaving before she could actually answer. She used the time to grieve in the only way the situation allowed her, quietly and alone, because there was no one left who wanted to hear it. On the morning of the wedding, a stylist arrived sent, she assumed, by Tae-hyun, though he never confirmed it, and helped her into a simple, elegant dress that fit like it had been chosen with more thought than the circumstances suggested. She stared at herself in the mirror for a long moment afterward, trying to reconcile the woman looking back at her with the one who'd been running barefoot through the rain 3 nights earlier. She didn't recognize either version exactly. She just recognized that she was still standing. The registration office smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. A clerk barely looked up from his desk as Tae-hyun signed first, his handwriting sharp and economical, then slid the pen toward her without ceremony. Amara signed beneath his name. It was, she thought, the least romantic moment of her entire life, and somehow that made it easier to get through. Tae-hyun placed a plain gold ring on her finger. His hand was steady. Hers wasn't, and she watched him notice that, watched something flicker behind his eyes that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't quite indifference either. "It's done," he said. It didn't feel done. It felt like the opening line of something she didn't have a name for yet. By the next morning, the news had already broken, and Seoul had already decided what to think about it. Richard Bennett's daughter marries his greatest enemy. The headlines ran in every language the city's papers were printed in. Talk shows debated it before noon. Somewhere in the churn of speculation, a rumor took hold, half true, half fabricated, that Amara had orchestrated her father's death herself, in partnership with the very man she'd just married. Amara read none of the actual articles. She didn't need to. She felt the weight of them in the way Tae-hyun's household staff looked at her when she moved her few belongings into the mansion's east wing, like she was something dangerous that had been allowed inside without proper vetting. The house was enormous in a way that felt less like luxury and more like isolation. Marble floors that swallowed sound. Guards stationed at every entrance, expressions carefully blank. Cameras in places she hadn't noticed until she caught one turning, almost imperceptibly, to track her down a hallway. No one trusted her. She understood that. What she hadn't expected was how much it would sting anyway. She confronted Tae-hyun about it on her second night there, finding him in his office long after most of the house had gone quiet. "You said I was your wife," she said, standing in the doorway. "Not your prisoner." He didn't look up from the documents on his desk. "Then stop acting like someone who has something to hide." "Don't. Everyone has something to hide, Ms. Bennett." "Mrs. Kang," she almost corrected him. She didn't. She wasn't sure yet that she wanted the name. "Your men follow me to the bathroom," she said. "My men follow instructions. If it bothers you, earn the instructions being different." "Exactly do I earn that?" "By existing quietly enough that no one notices I'm here." For the first time since she'd arrived, he looked up. Something in his expression shifted, not quite warmth, but attention, the specific kind he seemed to reserve for things he hadn't fully solved yet. "By surviving the first month," he said. "That's usually when I find out whether someone's worth trusting. If I don't survive it, then the question becomes irrelevant." She left without responding, because she didn't trust herself to keep her voice steady if she stayed. That night sleep came in fragments, Broken by every unfamiliar sound, the mansion made settling into darkness. When she finally drifted off, it didn't last. She woke to the particular stillness of a room that felt wrong before her mind could explain why. The lamp beside her bed had been left on low, and in its glow, she saw it, a single folded note resting on her pillow, close enough to have been placed there by someone standing directly over her while she slept. Her hands went cold before her mind caught up with what she was reading. 4 words, cut from newspaper print, pressed flat against the silk. "You should have died with your father." She didn't scream. She didn't move for a long moment, caught somewhere between the horror of the message and the deeper horror of what it implied. Someone had gotten close enough to leave it while she was defenseless, in a house that was supposed to be the safest place in Seoul. She heard footsteps in the hallway before she'd fully processed either fear. Tae-hyun appeared in her doorway already half-dressed, alert in a way that told her he hadn't been asleep either. He saw the note over her shoulder before she could find the words to explain it, and something in his jaw tightened, not quite fear, but close enough to it that she found herself, absurdly, more frightened by his reaction than by the note itself. He didn't ask if she was okay. He crossed the room, picked the note up by its edge without touching the surface, and was already dialing before he'd finished reading it a second time. "Someone got into this house," he said into the phone, voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "Tonight, her room, find out who and find out how before I have to ask twice." He ended the call and turned back to her. Amara had pulled her knees up to her chest without quite deciding to, arms wrapped around herself. "You said no one would touch me," she said quietly. "You said your name would protect me. It will." His voice was low, certain, though something beneath the certainty sounded almost like an apology he wasn't willing to say outright. "Whoever did this made a mistake tonight. They just told me they're already inside my walls, and I intend to make that very costly for them." She looked up at him, searching his face for something to hold on to. For the first time since the night she'd knocked on his gate, she wasn't sure if the fear she saw there was for himself or for her. He didn't leave the hallway outside her door for the rest of the night. She didn't ask him to stay. She simply noticed, near dawn, that he still hadn't gone. The days that followed settled into a strange, watchful rhythm. Amara and Tae-hyun rarely shared more than a few sentences over meals, and even those felt like negotiations, careful, measured, testing how much ground either of them was willing to give. He worked constantly, disappearing into his office for hours she couldn't account for. She wandered the mansion's endless rooms like a woman house-sitting a life that wasn't hers, unsure which doors she was allowed to open. But small things started to shift, quietly enough that she almost didn't notice them happening. He began adjusting the guard rotation around her wing without ever mentioning why, and it took her almost a week to realize the change coincided exactly with the hours she liked to walk the garden alone. Her coffee started arriving each morning, made precisely the way she took it, too much cream, barely any sugar, though she was certain she'd never told anyone in the house how she liked it. Twice, when grief kept her from finishing dinner, a tray appeared quietly outside her bedroom door later that same night, still warm, with no note and no explanation. She didn't ask him about any of it. Some instinct told her that asking would make him stop. One night, a nightmare dragged her out of sleep, gasping her father's voice, warning her about something she still couldn't name, dissolving into the sound of a door slamming shut behind her. She sat upright in the dark for a long moment, heart hammering, before she gave up on sleep entirely and opened her bedroom door to walk off the panic. Tae-hyun was sitting on the floor just outside it, back against the wall, eyes open, like he'd been there for some time. She stared down at him. "Were you protecting me?" "Don't flatter yourself," he said, not moving. He didn't leave. She didn't ask him to. She simply sat down on the floor a careful distance away, knees pulled to her chest, and let the silence between them do something that words hadn't managed yet. "My father used to sit outside my door when I had nightmares," she said eventually, not quite looking at him. "When I was young, before things got complicated between us." Tae-hyun didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it before. "My brother used to do the same for me," he said. Before he died, it was the first piece of himself he'd offered her without her having to pry it loose. She didn't push for more. She understood somehow that this was already more than he'd meant to give. Story hitting different than you expected. Smash that like button. It helps this channel more than you know. The first time Seoul saw them together in public was at a business gala 3 weeks into the marriage, hosted at a private hall lit in soft gold. filled with the kind of people who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. Amara wore black, understated but sharp, and felt every gaze in the room measure her the moment she walked in on Tae-hyun's arm. He wore the expression of a man silently mapping every threat in the room before the appetizers had even arrived. "Smile," he murmured, close to her ear. "You're supposed to look like you chose this." "I did choose this," she murmured back, "just not for the reasons anyone in this room thinks." A rival gang leader named Yoon Seok-jin approached her halfway through the evening, older, silver-haired, polished in a way that made his smile feel more like a warning than a courtesy. "Infamous Mrs. Kang," he said, taking her hand before she could think to pull it back. "Care to dance?" Before she could answer, Tae-hyun was beside her, his hand settling at the small of her back with quiet, deliberate ownership. "My wife doesn't dance with other men," he said. Seok-jin's smile didn't waver. He released her hands slowly, like a man choosing to rather than being forced to, and walked away with a patience that unsettled her more than any outright threat could have. "I thought this was a fake marriage," Amara whispered once he was out of earshot. "In front of my enemies," Tae-hyun said later that night, at a private dinner arranged to convince a nervous business partner their marriage was genuine. They sat across a candlelit table from each other, playing the parts of a couple neither of them had auditioned for. Somewhere between the second course and a story Tae-hyun told with more warmth than she'd ever heard from him, the performance stopped feeling entirely like a performance. When the moment came, when the business partner glanced their way, expecting the kind of tenderness only real couples bothered with, Tae-hyun leaned in and kissed her. It was supposed to be for show. Neither of them pulled away as quickly as the moment required. Afterward, in the car home, they sat in a silence that felt louder than any argument they'd had so far, both staring straight ahead, both very aware that a line had just been crossed that neither of them had actually agreed to cross. "That wasn't necessary," Amara said finally. "He wasn't even looking at us." "I know," Tae-hyun said. He didn't explain further. She didn't ask him to. The rest of the ride passed in a silence that had changed shape entirely from the one they'd started with. Amara found the key by accident. She'd been sitting with one of the few photographs she'd managed to grab before running that first night, her father, younger, laughing at something out of frame, when she noticed the backing had been tampered with. A small brass key slid free into her palm. She didn't know what it opened, but she knew her father had hidden it there on purpose. She didn't tell Tae-hyun right away. She told herself it was because she didn't trust him yet. The truer answer was that she was afraid of what he'd do once he learned there was something worth finding. He caught her researching storage facilities 2 nights later, laptop open, key resting beside it. "Keeping secrets," he said, "not a question. Kept them from me since the night I arrived. That's different." The argument that followed pulled loose more than either of them expected. Tae-hyun told her, for the first time, what had actually happened between their families. His father and older brother, killed years earlier after a business deal with Richard Bennett collapsed. He'd grown up believing her father was responsible. Amara told him her father had always said the opposite, that the Kangs were dangerous, that she should stay far away. Both of them went quiet at the same moment, realizing someone had spent years making sure neither family ever heard the other's side. Before they could untangle it further, the house alarm tore through the silence. Intruders had breached the outer wall, not for Tae-hyun, but for her. Tae-hyun reached her first, pulling her behind him as gunfire cracked down the hallway, his security scrambling to catch up to an attack that had gotten further into his home than it should have. By the time it ended, 2 attackers were dead and the rest had vanished into the night. He checked her over with his hands shaking slightly, like he needed physical proof she was unharmed. "Not after your father's money," he said. "Then what?" He looked at the key still sitting on the desk. "Something he left with you." He led them to a storage unit on the edge of the city, registered under a name neither of them recognized. Inside, boxes of financial records and photographs told a story Richard Bennett had spent years quietly assembling, proof of a criminal network running beneath half of Seoul's legitimate businesses. Buried in it, evidence that the deal which destroyed both their families hadn't collapsed on its own. Someone both families had trusted had engineered it. Before they could find a name, Tae-hyun's phone lit up with screenshots, messages sent from Amara's number, discussing the location of his safe houses. Messages she'd never written. "I didn't send these," she said. He looked at the messages, then at her, and for the first time since the wedding, she watched him hesitate to believe her. "You said you'd never lie to me." "Not lying now. The evidence says otherwise." "The evidence said I killed my father too." He didn't answer that, You're getting close to the truth now. Comment your theory on who's really behind this before the next twist hits. She took the ring off her finger and set it on the table between them. He said nothing as she walked out. Within hours, though, his security uncovered what she couldn't have known. The messages had been routed through a device planted inside his own house. Someone close to him had done this. He was still working through the list of names when the call came. Amara had been taken. No struggle, no witnesses, just an empty apartment and a phone left behind with one message waiting. Your wife has the answer you've been searching for your entire life. Come alone, or she doesn't leave this the way she came in. Hyun-woo read it over his shoulder and shook his head. It's a trap. I know. Then why go? Hyun opened his hand. The ring she'd left behind sat in his palm. Because she's my wife. Pieces finally lined up on the way there. The man who'd engineered both families' ruin. The man who'd killed Richard Bennett once he got too close to the truth. The man who'd planted a device in Hyun's own house to frame the one person who might expose him, Yoon Seok-jin. The same man who'd asked Amara to dance, smiling like he had nothing to hide. Because at the time, he didn't need to. Amara woke bound, her head throbbing. Seok-jin sat across from her, unhurried, like a man already certain he'd won. Your father was clever, he said. Clever enough to almost ruin everything I built. But he made one mistake. He trusted you with the proof instead of destroying it. You killed him. I removed a problem. He said it the way other men discussed whether. And now his daughter is about to solve the second one for me. She worked quietly at the rope while he talked. Years of watching her father negotiate with dangerous men teaching her the one lesson that mattered now. Keep them underestimating you. Outside, gunfire started. Hyun had arrived. He moved through the compound like a man with nothing left to lose, because in every way that mattered, he didn't. He found the room by the sound of Seok-jin's voice. By the time he broke through, Amara had already freed one hand. Right on time, Seok-jin said, almost impressed. Let her go. Would I? She's the only leverage I have left. His smile thinned. Your father died because of Richard Bennett. Hyun, I simply finished what their war started. Hyun said, my father died because of you. What happened next moved fast enough that Amara would only remember it in pieces. Hyun closing the distance before Seok-jin could reach the weapon on the table, both men colliding into it, the gun skidding toward her instead. She didn't hesitate. She picked it up. Seok-jin froze at the sound of the safety clicking off. Don't, Hyun said, breathing hard, one hand pressed to a wound at his side. Let the truth kill him instead. His men flooded in seconds later, along with the police escort he'd quietly arranged before ever walking in alone, because alone had never meant unprepared. The documents went out that same night. Seok-jin's empire collapsed within the week. Amara was cleared of her father's murder in headlines nearly as loud as the ones that had once condemned her. If this story has you holding your breath, stick around, the ending is worth it. 3 days later, Amara stood in the mansion doorway with a bag over her shoulder. Hyun's side was bandaged beneath his shirt, healing. Contract is over, she said. I know. She set the ring on the table and turned to leave. Wait, she stopped. He crossed the room, picked up the ring, and took her hand before she could pull it back. Contract is over, he said again, sliding it back onto her finger. But the marriage isn't. Why, for the first time, he answered without calculating what it would cost him. Because I didn't fall in love with the daughter of my enemy. I fell in love with you. She looked down at the ring, the same one she'd worn into a fake wedding, a house full of enemies, a room where she'd nearly died twice. It didn't feel heavy anymore. She married her father's enemy to survive one impossible night. She never expected that somewhere between the lies, the danger, and a ring she almost gave back, he'd become the one thing she couldn't survive losing. If you made it to the end, you already know this channel tells the stories no one else will. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.